Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week, we dive into the stories, technology, and ideas shaping a sustainable and profitable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today I have Dr. Frank Mitloehner from the University of California, Davis. Dr. Frank is the director for the CLEAR Center at the University of California, Davis. The CLEAR Center was started to bring clarity to the intersection of animal agriculture and the environment, so we can make informed decisions about foods that we eat while reducing environmental impacts. Dr. Frank's passion and commitment for air quality in animal agriculture gotten him recognized across the globe as an expert in this area. I thought it would be a good idea to have Dr. Frank on the podcast to talk about some of the myths and opportunities around the greenhouse gas emissions story and specifically methane when it comes to livestock. So we're going to go in depth on this topic today with an expert in this field. So I hope you enjoy this episode and listen closely to what Dr. Frank Mitloehner has to say. Well, on today's episode, I have the pleasure of having on Dr. Frank Mitloehner from the University of California, Davis campus. And you've been there for over 20 years now in the Department of Animal Science, a well-known leader in that department and well-known around the world for some of the work that you've been doing in your career over the last 20 years. So thanks for being here today, Dr. Frank.
Thank you for having me.
We had the producers from World Without Cows, the video on some of the myths and misconceptions about livestock in agriculture and GHG emissions. And a lot of that stuff that was talked about in that video, you were actually in that video and you brought up some of the misconceptions and some of the issues around that. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper today into that and some of the work that you've been doing in your career. So before we get into that, why don't you give us a little bit of backstory of your career, how you got to where you are, and what got you interested and really focusing in on air quality and emissions in livestock?
Yeah, so I am a native from Germany, and way back when, some 30-something years ago, I got really interested in sustainability. Long before it was a hot topic anywhere, definitely in the United States. And my original angle was more animal welfare related, and then it morphed into environmental quality interests. And I did a master in agriculture engineering at a German university in Leipzig, and then my Ph.D. In Texas at Texas Tech University, where I focused on the impact of beef production on air quality. And I also studied animal welfare issues there. Did my PhD and lived in Lubbock, Texas for 5 years, and then moved from there to Davis, California back in 2002. So some 23 years ago. I'm a professor there and air quality specialist. So I do research and extension around the impact animal agriculture has on the environment. And I do a lot of outreach. So as an extension specialist, it's natural for us to bring university information out to the rest of the world. But I went a step further and established a center called the CLEAR Center, CLEAR. The CLEAR Center is a sustainability center that does both research in this field on how to advance, how to promote animal agriculture sustainability, and equally important, we have a communications core in the CLEAR Center consisting of communications professionals who help me communicate the story around animal agriculture and not just with the agricultural sector, but particularly with the rest of the world.
In that CLEAR Center, that's based at the University of California, Davis campus as well then?
Yes.
Okay. One thing that I wanted to dig into right away here is I know I did some reading of a lot of the work that you've done even before preparing for this interview. But I know one thing that I've heard you say multiple times when I heard you speak or saw some of the videos of you speaking. You said before that methane is not CO2. And methane, when we're talking about livestock, that's the thing that always comes up when we're talking about cattle in the environment, right? You hear methane's kind of the hot button term that everyone brings up. So methane is not CO2. So can you explain this difference for our audience of methane and CO2 and how they behave in the atmosphere? And we'll get into why that's so important after that.
Yeah, there are three main greenhouse gases. One of them is CO2, carbon dioxide. And it's largely the result of us burning fossil fuels like oil, coal, gas. When we drive a car, for example, we burn gasoline, and out of the tailpipe comes CO2. The other greenhouse gas, the second one, is methane. And the main source for methane are all kinds of sources that have oxygen-deprived processes associated with it. So whether that's a landfill or a swamp or a cow's rumen, in all those we form methane. And the third one is nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide, N2O, is a gas that's largely produced when we put nitrogen fertilizer into the ground. Soil microbes convert some of that nitrogen into this very potent greenhouse gas. These greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, all have one thing in common, and that is when a solar beam hits them, they trap the heat from that solar radiation, and and just like a thermocan or a cup, an insulated cup, it traps the heat and for a prolonged period of time. Now, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide are different insofar that CO2 among those three is the least potent, meaning per molecule, it traps the least amount of heat. Methane traps the heat almost 30 times more per molecule than CO2 does. And nitrous oxide traps the heat 265 times more than CO2. So that's the analogy I like to use is one of a styrofoam cup versus a China cup versus a Starbucks $20 insulated cup. So you can put coffee into those three beverage containers. We all know the coffee stays warm at different length depending upon which container you use. The same is true for these greenhouse gases. So CO2 does trap the heat, but not as effective as methane, and methane not as effective as nitrous oxide. That's the one difference. The other difference is CO2 and nitrous oxide, these two gases, are long-lived. Once they're in the atmosphere, they stay there for a long time. In the case of CO2, once we burn fossil fuel, like, as I said, oil, coal, and gas, and we produce CO2, that CO2 stays in the air for about 1,000 years. It's different for methane. I already said methane is a potent greenhouse gas per molecule, much more potent than CO2, but it's not just produced by sources such as cows, but it's also naturally destroyed by a process called oxidation. And this oxidation process destroys methane after about 10 to 12 years, and then it's gone. So, just to recap, methane is a gas that's potent per molecule, but thank God it's short-lived. Okay, it is not just produced by sources, it's also destroyed by sinks. And that destruction by sinks is often forgotten or neglected or intentionally not mentioned.
Yeah.
Depending upon who tells the story, those who don't like animal agriculture very much, they will always neglect the fact that methane is short-lived and that methane is not just produced but also destroyed. But it's very important. It's not just a little nuance, it's very important. Why? Because if we learn to reduce methane, and we reduce methane by more than 0.3% per year, I repeat, by 0.3% per year, then that means that the source we reduce that methane from will not contribute any additional warming to our planet. So a 0.3% reduction per year from, let's say, a dairy farm or a beef operation or so, will lead to a situation where this operation will not cause additional warming. Why? Because more methane is destroyed through oxidation, this natural process. More methane is destroyed than we replenish through our livestock production, if we slightly reduce that gas every year. And the reason why that's important is not to diminish its importance or deflect off the responsibility of animal agriculture, to greenwash, so to say. But the reason why this is important to mention is because it tells us how important a player animal agriculture is in contributing to a solution to our climate worries. Namely, if we learn to manage this gas effectively, then we can help reduce warming. And that's a big deal.
So why do you hear the common claim out there in the media where livestock produce more emissions than the transportation sector? I've heard that many, many times. And I think policymakers seem to have that same mindset in their head. So where does that misleading statement come from?
This was a very unfortunate event, namely the publication of Livestock's Long Shadow, a publication that came out authored by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, back in 2006. They said in this Livestock's Long Shadow executive summary that the livestock sector produces 18% of all global greenhouse gases, and that the livestock contribution to climate change is greater than that of transportation. I was the one with my team here who refuted that and who showed the FAO why the claim was inappropriate and wrong, and they later accepted my criticism and then no longer ran that comparison of livestock to transportation. What was wrong was that the methodology to quantify the impact of livestock to warming, that impact was calculated using what's called a life cycle assessment, where you look at all impacts livestock have, not just the animals themselves or their manure, but also the feed production. And prior to the feed production, the soil where the feeds are grown. After the animals are dead, obviously the rendering and transportation of livestock products to supermarkets and the cooking of a steak and all of that all went into the calculation of livestock's contribution to climate change, the entire life cycle, so to say. And that's a comprehensive way of doing it, and it's not wrong, it's right. But on the transportation side, they didn't do the same thing. They didn't look into what goes into making cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, all the steel and the rubber and the aluminum and
the infrastructure for it to go on. And
exactly. But they only looked at tailpipe emissions for transportation. So they looked at a very complex picture for livestock versus a very rudimentary one for transportation. And that was flawed, and they took that back. And the 18% number was later also corrected, away from 18%, from now 11%. And that's the total contribution of livestock globally. That's not in the US, that's globally, okay? So it has changed from 18% to now 11%, that the FAO says livestock contributes to climate change globally. In the United States, to give you a comparison, the Environmental Protection Agency says all livestock in the United States combined emits 4% of all greenhouse gases. That's beef, dairy, swine, poultry, everything combined, 4% of all emissions.
That misconception is still floating out there, even though they've retracted it, and you still hear that in the media. But as you said, you refuted that, and that makes sense on the methodology. And that's why it's so important to understand the whole story and methodology being used when people make a statement about something, right?
Yes.
I've been thinking about this for quite a while, and I figured you'd be the best person to ask this question to. So you were saying methane has a life cycle, and it gets broken down in roughly 10 years. And I'm kind of a history buff. I love studying, especially American history. And if you look back and look at the numbers that were expected to be in the U.S., 250 years ago of ruminants, before we had cattle, livestock roaming the prairies, we had obviously bison and some other ruminants that were roaming the prairies. And I did some study before we got on today, and it was estimated that 70 to 100 million bison, which are about double the size of most cattle, roamed the U.S. and Canadian prairies 250 years ago. And today we have roughly 90 million cattle in the same region. And over the last really probably 150 years. As the bison numbers have come down, we've replaced those with those cattle, right? So it wasn't just adding 90 million on top of the bison. It was basically a replacement factor. So with what you're saying, methane being reduced, or methane life cycle of 10 years, what does that look like, 250 years ago with the methane that was being produced over, the North America during that time versus what it is today? Is it more potent today than it was back then? Or are we just measuring it now and looking to try to get that number down in order to offset some of the CO2 emissions that we're having?
So I will now give you the most recent estimates for historic bison and large antelope versus present ruminant contributions, and also provide a little nuance as to how much does it matter to compare the historic versus present day emissions. So in the pre-European settlement days, we had approximately 60 million bison in the US, and 40 million large antelope. So if you add these up, you'll come to a total of 100 million large ruminants, number that's similar to the one you just mentioned. So we had 100 million large ruminants about 250 years ago. Today, we have 90 million beef and 9 million dairy cows. So approximately 100 million large ruminants again. So we replaced a large wild ruminant herd, and these are large ruminants, with domesticated large ruminants of approximately the same size. So one could now say, so then what's the big deal? We have just changed and switched out one versus the other, but it's still ruminant emissions. It's true. If you come from a logic perspective, not much has changed with respect to greenhouse gas emissions of ruminant animals in North America for the last 250 years. But it doesn't matter. From a regulatory perspective, what happened historically doesn't matter. From a regulatory perspective, what happens from natural sources today doesn't matter. They don't care about wildlife any more than they do about volcanoes or oceans, because agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency have as their purview to estimate and mitigate human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, those that can be mitigated. Because we can't really mitigate, let's say, volcanoes or oceans or antelope or something like that. But what we can mitigate are all human activities, like driving cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, what we eat. All of that can be modified. And that's what these agencies care about. So from an intellectual perspective, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, okay? Ruminant animals in this country have not really changed large in numbers and have not changed much in regards to how much greenhouse gases are emitted by them and therefore how much warming they have caused. But humans have a choice as to what they eat, right? We could choose to eat something else, and then we would not produce the kind of greenhouse gases associated with animal agriculture. We would replace emissions of animal agriculture with emissions from plant agriculture, and that's a fair point. So I told you before, we see about 4% of all greenhouse gases in the United States today coming from beef, dairy, swine, poultry, and so on, 4%. So the question that some of my colleagues have asked themselves and later published in the peer-reviewed literature was, what were to happen if the US with 330 million people were to go vegan? The entire US, okay, no more animal source foods were consumed by anybody in this country, just as an extreme math exercise. And what they found was that we wouldn't have 4% less greenhouse gases, because now we don't have livestock anymore, but because we have to replace the consumption of animal source foods now with plant-based foods, we would reduce a total of 2.6% of all greenhouse gases if all 330 million Americans would forego the consumption of animal source foods. Okay, so 2.6% would be the total reduction in the extreme case that everybody were to go 100% plant-based. Okay, 2.6%. If we were to go meatless Monday, as some people say we should, we would reduce 0.3% of our greenhouse gases in the United States. And all of that is published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So these are the real numbers, and now comes reality. Okay, now comes reality. How many people in the United States consume animal source foods? The answer is in 98%, almost all refrigerators in the United States today, you find animal source foods such as meat, dairy, eggs. 98%. This very small percentage that does not have animal source foods in their refrigerators is oftentimes very vocal about it and make them sound themselves as if there were some massive wave that's rolling over the United States and the rest of the world, and everybody now moving into plant-based eating habits. That's not happening. That's happening in somebody's heads, but it's not happening in the refrigerators and on the stoves of our nation.
And I think a lot of restaurants that moved in that direction figured that out pretty quickly.
Yeah, and if you were to take a look at the stock market, it's some of those plant-based alternatives that were touted over the last few years as the big and upcoming major movement. You will find that they have tanked like nothing else I've seen tanking before.
Yeah, most of them are about 5% of the original stock values when they were IPO'd. Let's go back to the policy side of things. We've seen a lot of interesting policies come out of Europe and some other European centric countries. What are your thoughts on policy making around this topic, and what do lawmakers in the U.S. really need to look at in order to get this right?
So throughout the world, and I mean throughout the world, last year alone I visited 26 different countries throughout the world, from Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina to New Zealand and Australia to Finland and the Netherlands and Belgium and so on. Throughout the world, there are now real efforts to reduce the impact of animal agriculture on the environment. Okay, these are sustainability efforts that are happening in different parts of the world. And to my surprise, most of the places where that happens are places where they use what I call the cane approach. We want you, the farmer, to reduce emissions, and we force you to do so by rules and regulations, fines, or taxes. Okay. For example, New Zealand wanted to implement a methane tax for ruminants. Ireland thought about, let's get rid of 200,000 cows to reduce the carbon footprint. The Netherlands wanted to get rid of a third of their dairies and swine operations, all aimed at reducing emissions using the cane approach. I've been observing this, and I've consulted with governments in these different countries, with all kinds of organizations, and I shared my opinion with them that this is an approach that would most likely fail. And I proved my point by showing them how the opposite approach, namely one that we are experimenting with in California right now, will not fail but prevail. And that's what I call the carrot approach. The carrot approach being one where government says, we want our farms to reduce emissions. Many ways are already understood and technically feasible. But we don't just shove it down your throats. We work with you and not against you in reducing these emissions. How do we do that? We do it by using a voluntary, incentive-based approach. That's a mouthful. A voluntary, incentive-based approach. What does that mean? It means that the government says we want you to reduce emissions and we help you pay for it. We want to make this a cost-effective way of reducing emissions. In California, we are very close to achieving our goal of reducing 40% of methane, the most important greenhouse gas for animal agriculture, because the government is using a voluntary incentive-based approach. They pretty much pay farmers to reduce emissions like they pay private citizens to switch from one car to another car, let's say to an electric car, which is also incentivized through federal and through state incentive payments. And surprise, surprise, it worked. Our farmers are almost at target And I want to emphasize the target of 40% reducing of methane or reduction of methane is unprecedented in the world. Our farmers are very close to being there. We're 2/3 along the way of achieving that 40% reduction of methane. So what is my experience with respect to the cane approach? It's a very negative one. I have not seen one country in the world that used the cane approach that succeeded. And my experience with the carrot approach is the opposite. It's very effective. Farmers endorse it. They work with those policymakers, with those government agencies, and it just works. Every listener of yours who is a father or mother will know that if you compare the cane versus the carrot with your kids, the one works, the other one doesn't. It's time that governments understand that too.
And what are before we get into some of the detailed work that the farmers used in California, do you want to explain to the audience a little bit more in depth the two kinds of methane emissions that we're looking at from cattle, and also what the ratio looks like or what percentage each one is for the total methane makeup of livestock?
Yeah, so for ruminant livestock, so chiefly beef and dairy, the main pathways of methane formation are: one, enteric emissions, and these are methane emissions that develop in the rumen, in the first compartment of their digestive tract, and they are caused by microbes producing that gas. Okay, every time ruminant livestock digests cellulose-containing feed, such as grasses, those microbes produce methane, and that methane builds up in the rumen and sooner or later needs to come out. And despite urban myths of it coming out from the back end, it really comes out from the front end, and it's belched out. So that's called enteric emissions. The second pathway for methane to be produced is through animal manure. When and if that animal manure is stored under oxygen-deprived conditions, in a lagoon, let's say, under anaerobic conditions, in other words, then methane is formed as well, because the same methane-forming microbes that form in the rumen of a cow are also present in the lagoon of, let's say, a dairy. And so it's enteric emissions and manure that produces methane. And both are avenues for us to cut that gas. And with respect to how important are these relatively to one another, on the dairy side, in the dairy industry, the more important pathway is enteric emissions. But more and more dairies switch over to lagoon storage of their manure, and that lends itself to methane formation. So I would say about 60%, 60 of methane on the dairy side comes from enteric and 40% of manure. On the beef side, it's different, because here the manure, as long as the animals are on pasture, is just deposited on pasture, so not under anaerobic conditions, but under aerobic conditions. And here methane is not formed from the manure. In a feedlot later in the life of the beef animal, the manure is still not stored under anaerobic conditions, but it's deposited on the feedlot surface, exposed to oxygen, also not lending itself to methane formation. So on the beef side of things, the vast majority of methane stems from enteric and not from animal manure.
Now, you said California dairy farmers have dropped their emissions levels by 40% so far in the work that you've been doing with them. What is that mainly from? Is that putting in digesters, covering manure pits, or is that more so from some of the other avenues of feed additives and things like that?
So the goal here in California, it's a law. It's not just a goal, it's a law. It's called SB 1383. It mandates a 40% reduction of methane. That law was put in effect maybe 5 years or so ago, and not very long ago, and it needs to be achieved. The 40% reduction needs to be achieved by the year 2030. So in 5 years from now, we need to reduce 40% less methane than we did back in 2013. We are not there yet. We are not at the full 40%, but we are 2/3 at reaching the 40%. Okay, so we have made huge strides. So how have we gotten there? First of all, our cows are becoming more and more productive year by year. We are now at a point where most dairies produce anywhere between 80 to 100 pounds of milk per cow per day. That was never believed to be possible some 10 or 20 years ago, but it is the reality today. And by cows becoming more productive, we can use a relatively smaller herd to produce a given amount of product that's being produced. So we are producing almost constant levels of milk with shrinking numbers of animals. And the herd shrinkage is about 0.5, so half of 1% per year. And that herd size shrinkage means less methane belched, less methane produced in the form of manure emissions. So that's one way of reducing methane, that our cows are simply becoming more productive. The second most important way, well, it's not the second most, it's actually a second way, is the use of anaerobic digesters. So what used to be an open lagoon where the manure was stored before, many of those lagoons are now receiving a cover. The gas that's generated from the manure is now being captured, much of which is methane. And then this biogas mixture is cleaned, and the methane is concentrated and put into the pipeline, into the utility pipeline. And then it is merged with the other natural gas that's in the utility pipeline, because methane is nothing else than natural gas. And our farmers get paid for it. So this methane gas that stems off those anaerobic lagoons that are now covered is a new income source for the dairy, and a very significant one, I might add. So in addition to selling milk, these dairies are now selling their biogas, which is made into methane, and that methane is going into heavy-duty trucks and buses for the public transportation system. So now, by using a technology like that, you're reducing emissions on the dairy, and you're reducing emissions in the transportation system, because now trucks and buses that previously burned diesel are burning a much cleaner biofuel. And that reduces emissions on both sides, the dairy, so the farm, and the transportation system. And that is being done in a way that's very cost effective. In the state of California, 2% of all methane reducing public funds, public state taxpayer funds, 2% of those funds are used to reduce emissions on dairies. But this 2% investment of all taxpayer dollars for methane reduction leads to 30% reductions of this gas statewide. So it's a 15x return on investment. And no other methane reducing sector in the state of California is more effective than our dairy industry.
Two things that you pointed out here are both profit opportunities for farms, right? You talked about increasing production with fewer animals, so making the farm more efficient, and capturing the methane and selling that off. So those are two profit opportunities. Do you see things like Bovaer or seaweed or oregano, those type of products, if they don't have any other efficiency benefits to them, which I think is still kind of up in the air, do you see those moving forward as another way to push forward in this mitigation?
Yeah, so here at UC Davis and other places throughout the world, but particularly here at UC Davis, we have studied dozens of these feed additives. And the ones that you just mentioned were among those. I'm, for example, currently doing a study on Bovaer. That's the longest ever done study. 500 days of feeding this feed additive to dairy cows. We look at the impact it has on methane, as well as on milk yield, on components, on health of cows, and so forth and so forth. And what I can tell you is additives like Bovaer are very effective in reducing methane. You could reduce up to 80% if you wanted to, 80. But if you go that high with your methane reduction, then the cow will eat less. And we don't want that, of course. And so, right. So what we want is a reduction of methane that doesn't impact in any negative way performance of those animals. And here, a reduction of 30 to 40% is possible and likely. It's not just Bovaer, it's also other methane inhibitors that can do the trick. There are other examples of feed additives that are called rumen modifiers that have minor impacts, let's say 5 or maybe 10% reduction of methane. But oftentimes these impacts are of short-term nature or just not as high enough to really make this investment pay. So the question a farmer, of course, has is, why would I reduce methane? I mean, what's in it for me other than the green look it has? And the answer to that is that many of the companies that are out there that deal with dairy and with beef, let's say the Starbucks or the Nestle's or the McDonald's or the Burger King, these companies have climate goals that are publicly announced and that they are committed to. And for them to become net zero by the year X means that the supply chains that support them with dairy or meat, that they have to reduce emissions too. And that means the farmers. And so the Starbucks and Nestle's and McDonald's and Burger King and so on now more and more often want their farmers to use feed additives to reduce emissions so that the life cycle of the product is lowered with respect to emissions. And in many cases, these companies now pay for the feed additives, or they pay incentives. Or there are models where companies or co-ops also pay incentives, as well as where, let's say, USDA funds and so on are used to augment so that overall the farmer does not have a negative balance sheet as a result of using feed additives. So there are different models being looked at right now so that farmers get carbon credits. Okay, that's the take-home message on that. Most of the feed additives are still in their early stages of implementation. Bovaer is the first one that the FDA signed off on, and that is in the marketplace. And I think it will take off, as will some of the other ones as well.
Sticking with Bovaer here real quick, we've seen some, not really in the US, but definitely in the UK, we've seen some really interesting backlash from the public on the use of Bovaer. Do you think that's going to continue in other parts of the world? Or do you think if we want to use that tool, how do we not lose that opportunity, I guess? I mean, we had that with several other tools in the beef and dairy industries that we've lost just because of bad public perception that probably really wasn't accurate.
Livestock production today is not what it used to be in the 1960s. Okay, we are using technologies. We are using technologies to keep animals healthy. We are using technologies to get them pregnant. We are using technologies to help them grow and so on. It's not that we live in the old McDonald's had a cow kind times anymore with red barns in the background and animals on pasture and that's it. But technology has found its way onto the farm like it has found its way into factories that produce cell phones or televisions or cars. Okay, so without the use of technologies, we'd be much less efficient in producing food, and much less efficiency leads to much higher environmental footprints. For example, I just went to the World Ag Expo and I saw drones being sold that will fly across the field, and these drones will see what part of the field needs to be irrigated or requires plant protection. And only those plots then receive plant protection and not the entire field that might not need it. The same is true for other approaches where, let's say, a farmer can use a device to identify heat stress in cows or to identify whether a cow is in heat and needs to be impregnated, and so forth and so on. So these technologies we cannot even imagine a life without these technologies anymore. And we don't want it, okay? We just don't want it. We have to explain, however, to the consumer why the use of technologies in animal production is no more or less acceptable than the technology used in plant production. We are using technologies, period. The reason why the furrows of the fields that you drive by with your car are so absolutely straight is because these tractors are now satellite guided. Okay, it's not the tractor, it's not the farmer that's running this thing. These things are now satellite guided. Okay, and they could drive, many of them already without a driver inside. So are we saying we don't want that because we would rather have the farmer walk in his boots across the field doing everything with stoop labor? Of course we don't. So there are technologies in the feed and feeding business, in the breed and breeding business, in the manure business that we cannot do without and shouldn't do without because they make agriculture better. Okay, that's not to say that we shouldn't use the least environmentally harmful and the most animal welfare enhancing and so on products. We should, and we are doing that. So there has been backlash, as you said, about the use of feed additives in certain parts of the world. And when you look at where that backlash is coming from, it's very interesting. It's largely coming from those players who are not positive around animal agriculture, who are in the anti-animal agriculture arena. And instead of them saying, yeah, we welcome animal agriculture to reduce its environmental footprint, they pipe up saying, we don't want it. We don't want anaerobic digesters. We don't want feed additives. We don't want any of those technologies, which we know reduce emissions. And now you have to ask yourself, why would they say we don't want these technologies that we know are effective? And the reason why they don't want it is because they have, and I'm just saying that now straight out, the reason why these activists are saying it is because they're not interested in reducing emissions. They're interested in reducing these farms. They want to get rid of animal agriculture, period. And it's now a question for the rest of society to either run with that or not run with that. And my vote is very clear. Let's work with farmers to help them make their businesses as sustainable as possible, improve animal welfare, improve the environmental standing of those operations, work with and never against our farmers.
And as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, 98% of the refrigerators have animal protein products in them. So apparently the rest of the world would like to have that opportunity to continue with the diets that they are choosing today. So I think it's important for livestock and animal agriculture sectors to get this piece right in the near future. So we don't risk very few people dictating what the rest of the world has the freedom to eat.
That's right. Absolutely.
Are there any other myths or misconceptions about greenhouse gas emissions, methane from livestock that we haven't discussed yet?
They are largely based around methane. People say, well, methane is so powerful that all we need to do is get rid of all the sources of this gas. But I already alluded to the fact that, yes, it's true this gas is very important, but what's also true is that if we learn to manage this gas, then we make something that could be a liability into an asset.
I think that's a very important point.
So that's really important because our farmers have the means of doing that and becoming one of the very few providers of a solution to our climate challenges, okay? And so in addition to our farmers producing the food we all consume, they can now do other ecosystem services if we incentivize them to do so.
One of the things I wanted to talk to you about on kind of a personal side. So you've been a prominent and sometimes polarizing voice in the livestock and climate conversation, kind of trying to help get rid of some misconceptions and mistruths that are there. What has been the most challenging criticism of your work, and how did you address that scientifically and personally?
So there are a couple of activist organizations like Greenpeace and others who have gotten into some of the mainstream media with their criticism of me and my center, the Clear Center. The criticism not being that my science is wrong. They're not touching my science at all. They are also not saying that I've done something unethical or fishy in any way, shape, or form. The only thing they criticize is the fact that I work with animal agriculture. And they say because he works with animal agriculture, he cannot be trusted. He's too close to industry. Mm. Now, I find that very interesting. Let me take you on a little tour here, okay? Let's just imagine I were not Frank Mitloehner, the livestock guy, but let's say I were Frank Mitloehner, a guy lowering emissions from the automobile sector. If I were then a vehicle engineer, then I would work on catalytic converters along with GMC and Chrysler and Ford and Mercedes, helping them to develop systems forecast to reduce emissions. Nobody would ever question that. Nobody would ever say, oh, you shouldn't work with Ford and Chrysler and GMC and Mercedes because that's the cars we drive.
You're too close.
Now, Frank Mitloehner is not a vehicle engineer. He is a cow engineer. He works with livestock to reduce emissions. And surprise, surprise, those industries that I'm seeking to help to reduce emissions work with me because they develop products to reduce emissions. And these products are the ones that we look at and try out in order to help farmers find out, are they feasible, are they cost effective, and so on. And to me, it is absolutely bewildering how that could be a cause for concern. It would be a cause for concern if I were to make a secret out of this. If I were to say, well, I'm not really working with the livestock sector. But of course, I am very open about it. I work with the livestock sector to reduce its emissions because I'm an agricultural expert for emissions. Of course, I work with agriculture. But this particular criticism has gotten me a one-pager in the New York Times. Believe it or not. A one-pager in the New York Times, in color.
You know how much that costs?
I don't want to know.
Free publicity, right?
It hasn't done anything to me or to us, anything negative. I mean, it has made us vastly popular and well known out there because when an article like this is in the New York Times, you have 50 plus million readers. But to me, it's actually very important and also a feather in the cap to see that the greatest critics of animal agriculture have put a target on my forehead, saying, this guy is a real problem for us, and the work they do is a real problem for us, because we seek to end animal agriculture. If I'm the person they need to focus on as one that prevents that from happening, then I take that.
Well, I think a lot of people in the livestock sectors appreciate what you do and the criticisms that you've taken for us and the work that you're doing. So I just want to say thank you for that. But one more thing that I really want to hit on, go back to the political and policy side of things. Two questions. Number one, with the political landscape shifting in the U.S. and what looks like to be starting globally, especially around climate policy, how do you see these changes influencing the direction of GHG mitigation efforts? Do you think it's going to hinder it, help it? Do you think it's going to help focus it on where it should be? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think much will change. And the reason why I say this is because what drives the whole focus around greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation is not a federal government or a state government. What drives it by and large are consumer concerns. So teenagers today or people in their 20s, college-age students, view these topics as being extremely important to their lives. If you ask a 20-year-old today what their top 3 concerns are in the world, if you go to cities and you ask students in cities as to what their top 3 concerns are, a lot of them, the majority of them, will have climate within the top 3 concerns. And if you ask them what one way is for them to reduce their personal contribution to it, they will all tell you, what I eat matters, okay? So that is one of the drivers. And that driver has influenced major chains like Starbucks, which is the world's largest consumer of milk because of their cappuccinos and lattes and so on. It drives Starbucks, it drives McDonald's, it drives Sam's Club and Costco and all the others to make topics like that of great importance to their company mission. And they all have zero emission goals, and they have stated them, and they are implementing them, and farmers are an integral part of that. So what's happening in Washington, D.C. or in other capitals is not as important as what's happening in these boardrooms throughout the world. And it's not just here in the U.S., it's really literally throughout the world. So the topic is not going away. The topic is, I think, an important one and will continue to be an important one because once farmers actually figure out that something that they perceive as a threat, perceive as a liability, that topic could become the opposite, a feather in their cap, because if they learn to manage this issue, they can be part of a solution. Once they figure that out, they jump onto that bandwagon. I've seen it, I don't know how many thousands of times. I give about 150 invited talks every year. And oftentimes, but not always, in front of farmers, oftentimes in front of companies of all sizes or government organizations and so on. And it's eye-opening to people, okay? It's eye-opening to people, and I think it's very important for us to make clear that folks understand this is not just some political game or so, but it is a real-world issue that we are part of and that we contribute to and that we can be a meaningful part of a solution for.
Well, you just answered my last question for the most part. My last question was going to be, what's your single biggest take-home message to farmers listening to this?
My single biggest take-home message to farmers is something that I heard the pork industry say for a long time. In fact, they have made it into their slogan. Their slogan is very simple: we care. Now, I thought about this quite a bit. We care. What does that mean? What that means is, in 2 words, their philosophy of caring about you, the consumer, and your needs, caring about the environment that makes up their farm, caring about the welfare and health of their animals, caring about the people who work with them and for them, caring about financial resources, okay, caring about sustainability, in other words, or some people would call it stewardship, is not something that we should or shouldn't do. It's something that's our legacy in animal agriculture, okay? We must do it. And it doesn't matter who the president in the White House is. This is something that is the absolute most important, the essence of what we do. And so don't let one or the other politician sway you into this or that being important. Being a farmer means you have to care, and you have to show that you care. And not just through your action. But 5 years ago, my father passed away. Before he did pass away, he said to me a very simple sentence. He said to me, Frank, do good things and talk about them. And what he meant by that was not brag about them, but talk about them, okay? Do good work and let the people who you care for know what these things are. And that's something that I want to tell every farmer. Do good things and talk about them. Talk about them with your family. Talk about them with your networks, with your community. Talk about them if you're on social media. Talk about them on social media. You don't have to talk to the New York Times, but you can talk to your networks, and you should, because you are actually a person who most people in the public trust. The public is just no longer so clear whether the food that they consume is grown on a farm. They associate a supermarket with the food they eat. Once they hear from farmers, you will see amazing things happening in their heads. It's your responsibility, like it is mine, to get the word out.
Well, those are great words of wisdom to end on. Dr. Frank Mitloehner, I really appreciate you being on the AgCulture Podcast today. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks so much again for listening to today's episode with Dr. Frank Mitloehner, professor and director at the Clear Center at the University of California, Davis campus. To find out more about the Clear Center and the work that Dr. Frank is doing, check out our show notes. We'll have a link in there for you, or just type it in Google, Clear Center, Dr. Frank Mitloehner, and it will probably be the first thing that comes up in Google. So now, if you have heard this podcast and found it interesting, I ask that you please share it with somebody that you know that would also find it interesting. That's how we grow our audience here on the AgCulture Podcast. Now, I'm doing some work on my own personal dairy farm around this topic. So if you're interested in hearing about that from me personally, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to connect with you and discuss more about what we're working on here at my farm in Michigan. And until next week, I'm Paul Windemaller. Thanks for listening to another episode of the AgCulture Podcast. We'll see you next week.